Hello. I am from New York, but now I live here as of 5 weeks ago. So that's fun. All right. So yeah, my name is Samira Herber. I received my MFA degree from the NYU Game Center, where I also later taught game studies. And I just moved to Vienna, and I'm currently just here as an independent researcher. So I'm going to talk to you about research that I've been kind of doing for the last year and a half. A lot of my research draws on ethnographic study of game communities. So I go into game communities, I play with them, I interview people there, I kind of observe what they do. And so that's a big part of what I'm going to talk to you about today in terms of how large multiplayer games can encourage pro-social behaviors. Um, Want to break this up into four parts. What does pro-social behavior in games look like? We've heard about this a little bit. We've also already heard during Frog so far about toxicity in games. I'm going to address that a little bit. But yeah, what are these behaviors we're looking for in games? And for the players to kind of display as they're engaging in these communities. Then I'm going to talk to you about the two game communities that I've spent a lot of time with, um, what the groups are, what the games are, and kind of things that I've noticed being around these groups. And then the two big lessons learned, the importance of having fluid groups, groups that have, changes in their membership and dealing with player turnover in that context, and then mentorship systems for new players. So kind of looking at game design elements in these games and how they've impacted the social behaviors within the associated gaming groups. So pro-sociality. I don't think it's news to anyone that games can encourage pro-social behaviors like collaboration, helping, sharing, sharing information, support. We've kind of heard about this already, right? There's a good amount of research that suggests that these behaviors do in fact occur in games, right? Especially in multiplayer games of various kinds. And in fact, there's also research that pretty strongly suggests that these games can carry over into the real world from what they're learned in games, right? So players don't just, help each other within the game. They can learn those skills, carry them over into the real world. That being said, a lot of online multiplayer games in particular are still kind of notorious for various levels of toxicity, right? So I kind of started my research with this question of how are these two things happening at the same time, right? If these games are teaching their players to help each other, to have empathy, to share, why are we also seeing toxicity in these spaces, right? There are, of course, systems in place to try to mitigate toxicity. For example, various reporting systems across a wide range of online games. So what I'm going to focus on a little bit more here is not just how we mitigate toxicity, but how we can actually emphasize the pro-social aspect of these games to kind of maybe overshadow tendencies for toxicity we might see, right? Like how can we emphasize the teaching of pro-sociality more to hopefully counteract toxic behaviors in these spaces. So an idea that has been thrown out for how to make games more, games communities more healthy, more, you know, pro-social, better at avoiding toxicity. It's been thrown out by Dan Cook and his kind of group of game designers, Project Horseshoe. They put out a report a few years back talking about designing for human scale games, and they talk about the importance of avoiding huge impersonal groups and really kind of emphasize this focus on creating games for small, intimate groups. And this sounds kind of nice, and there's something to be said for small groups where people all know each other, right? They all know who everyone else in the group is. Everyone kind of trusts each other. Everyone knows each other. But first of all, it's not practical for every game, right? If you're looking at especially kind of like the big famous online multiplayer titles, um, they rely on their big player bases, right? Like you can't just say, well, I guess we're going to limit Valorant to a player base of 50 people. We can't just say we're going to like limit our player base for XYZ MMO to only have 100 people and then they can all interact with each other all the time. That's not realistic for the developers and publishers of the game, right? Additionally, Small groups can bring with them their own challenges, especially if they kind of form as small groups as part of a bigger player base. So small subgroup formation. Back in 2006, Steinkühler and Williams already talked about this in terms of bridging networks and bonding networks. So bridging networks being more common in games with a larger player base where because of the size of that large player base, there's a lot of diversity among the kind of players you can draw in, or at least more opportunity for diversity, right? Because you have a big group, people from all kinds of walks of life, all kinds of backgrounds, right? Which can help players broaden their social horizons because they can encounter people from all over, right? Harder in a system like that to form closer relationships because you're not going to be able to interact with everyone in the group all the time, right? It's not impossible, they found, to form close relationships. It still happens, right? But it's harder if I'm playing a game that, has a million active players. Like, I can't interact with all of those players, obviously, right? They then kind of contrast that with bonding networks, which generally rely on smaller group size because a person can only have so many close relationships at any given time. Bonding networks are really good at helping players form trust between each other, right? It's a small group, people kind of know each other, you can form more intimate bonds with everyone else in your group because you can know each other on a more personal level. The potential flip side of that is, well, if it's a small group that's very tight knit, it might be harder for people from other backgrounds to enter the group, right? It might be harder to have that kind of diversity that you see in the bigger group of the bridging network. Additionally, those kinds of small groups can become kind of insular. Not necessarily, it doesn't mean that all small groups are inherently bad and inherently insular, but if you have a very small group, tight-knit group of 10 people that know each other super well and they stick together all the time, there is the potential for that group to kind of become isolated just with that small group of people, right? And if we go back to our kind of old school game studies, Huizinga kind of talks about what he sees as the danger of clubs. And I know we love our clubs in, at least where I'm from in Germany, we love clubs. So not all clubs are bad. I don't think that's what he's saying either. But what he kind of terms clubs are these groups that form, and especially when they develop this kind of artificial friend foe principle, when it's the idea that this is me and the boys in the club, this is me and my boys in my group, this is me and my group of my small tight knit group of people, and those are the others outside the group, right? So the idea that we have this kind of insulated group, we all back each other, we're in the group, we know each other really well, and then there are the outsiders, right? And how do those dynamics relate to, maybe we're really good at helping each other within our group and having those pro-social behaviors within our small group, but can we translate that to the outside world, to group people on the outside of our group? Maybe not. And so I want to see it. I'm going to take a look at how that transfer outside of small groups might be more possible, or how maybe we can avoid small groups becoming too insular in the first place in games. So the first game community that I spent a lot of time with is the Final Fantasy XIV community. And here's why. I was in grad school. I had never played an MMO before. And everyone I encountered who played this game said, I promise this one's not toxic like the other ones. And I didn't believe it, but people kept saying it. And I was intrigued by the fact that people who play the game talk about it in that particular way. Because I talk to people who play other games that are kind of notoriously toxic. I know a lot of people who play League, for example. Every single one of them, at some point or another, says, League is fun, but, you gotta deal, you're gonna encounter toxicity. It's gonna be in there. It's part of the game. It's not great, but you're gonna encounter it. It just is what it is. And a lot of the Final Fantasy XIV players I talked to had a very different kind of way of talking about the game. They said they didn't talk about it in yeah, there's toxicity, it's just normalized, you have to deal with it kind of way. They talked about it more in terms of the culture here is different. And I got curious and wanted to know why. Is that actually true? Does it feel different? And if so, why? Or why do people at least think that it feels different? Why does it on the side of the player read as being more pro-social, more kind than maybe other games. The other community that I spent time with is the Modern Enigma Society, which is actually a LARP organization. So they facilitate Vampire the Masquerade LARPs, well, all kinds of World of Darkness LARPs, but mostly Vampire the Masquerade. They used to have international locations. Now they're just in the United States. They are a national organization where kind of the national organizing unit creates this main story, and then it's split up into kind of local chapters. And so there are local games, but you also interact kind of with the community as a whole. So everyone is playing a game together. Theoretically, if you're playing regularly in the New York City game and you found yourself in, say, Denver, Colorado for the weekend when they have a game, you bring your character from New York to Denver, play with them, because it's all under the umbrella of this one narrative that's being put together by the national team. There's an element of, let's move to the next slide where I explain this. There's an element of in-person and online play to this. So most of the play that happens at the national and regional levels is online facilitated, because the United States is really big and not everyone can travel all the time, right? So a lot of that, the play at that level is online facilitated. It happens through Discord. It happens through sometimes Zoom calls. It happens through kind of online facilitated means. Whereas on the local level, gameplays, now in person. During the height of COVID, they moved to fully online, but it's back in person now. So what's interesting about this is that this system creates the small groups that Dan Cook, for example, kind of advocates for, right? Your local domain is going to be like 10 to 20 players these days, sometimes a little more, right? That's a small group of people that you can play with once a month, get to know really well, form really tight bonds with, right? And that works pretty well on the local level from what I've observed. I've played in 4, I believe, different local locations, and then also at the national level, and kind of have watched how people interact with each other. And except for one of those 4, people on the local level get along pretty well. They work together pretty well. There's generally like a good atmosphere when they play. The bigger issue is that they could not figure out how to take any of those like pro-social behaviors that they've learned within their local group and apply them to the rest of the organization. There have been in recent months a few local groups that have split off from the organization entirely because of various allegations and things that have happened, and a lot of it comes back to kind of domains fighting against each other. Not so much infighting, although that has happened in a few groups, but more that the loyalty to the local group and the bonds with the local group far outweigh any kind of connection that people form to other players on the national level, right? So the connections that players formed were all to their local group, and that's where players were mostly focused. And they were very unwilling, unable, had a hard time transferring those skills when playing with other people in the organization as a whole, but from other kind of local groups. It was very difficult. For example, there are every half year, I believe, there is a convention. There's one that happens once a year in person, but also online conventions where the intention is to bring everyone from the local groups together and play together online a little more frequently, right? But frequently, those conventions led to a lot of infighting, a lot of bad blood. And so the kind of loyalties to these small groups ended up being so strong that people were unwilling to engage with the diversity of the bigger group and were unwilling to seek dialogue with members of the bigger group that weren't part of the kind of local group that they were a part of. If you compare this, it's not a 100% comparison. Final Fantasy has a lot more players than the Modern Enigma Society has these days. But I do bring this up as an example of how smaller subgroups can be less isolated. Because in the Mez, the issue ended up being that these groups were very isolated. Technically, you can take your character and travel to another local group, but again, the US is really big and most people are not going to do that. So I lived in New York City. It's where I mostly played. The closest group to me was in New Jersey, 2.5-hour drive, closest group, right? The next closest group was in Massachusetts, 5-hour drive. So, and then it just gets longer, right? Someone playing in Colorado is not just going to fly out to Florida real quick to play a game there. So even though technically people based on the system of the game, could have played in other locations that never realistically happened. We don't have this problem with a purely online game, is one difference, right? You don't have to travel to play with someone on a different server, on a different data center. So the way it works in Final Fantasy XIV is these are the Square Enix owned data centers. There's a whole kind of talk to be had about third party owned data centers that I'm not going to get into that. But these four main regional data centers are owned by Square Enix directly. And so within each of these groups, there are data centers that then split off into more servers. What I've highlighted here is just the North American data centers and their servers. And you can travel. So if you're on the one of the North American servers, to any other server in North America and also Oceania, all of the other players from other data centers can travel to Oceania. But I can travel if my character is on a North American server to any of those other servers. I can't travel to the European servers or the Japanese servers, just real quick. However, if I were to move more permanently, I could transfer my character. So there is that option, right? It's not like I make my character in North America and I'm forever bound to that. What that enables, though, is that players mix a lot more. These smaller groups, the servers, are far less insulated than they were, like the local groups were in the mez, because people move between them way more frequently, right? Then, at least in North America, certain data centers have reputation for being more focused on certain elements of the game, right? Etha kind of has the reputation for being the raid heavy server, right? Crystal has a reputation for being more roleplay focused. So you can seek out servers based on what you're currently trying to do in the game, right? If you're trying to seek out a roleplay venue, you might hit up a Crystal server. If you're trying to find a static raid group, you might go to an Ether server, things like that. And so people move around a lot more based on what they're currently trying to do in the game, and they move around a lot more just because traveling and visiting people is fun because it's all online. It's easier to do. That helps prevent the servers from becoming too insulated. Another way that Final Fantasy XIV keeps groups from becoming too insular, too static is just the many options it has for forming temporary kind of working groups, right? So on the right is the party finder, where people will just say, hey, I'm trying to run this content. Who wants to join my group just to like run this content, right? And you're going to party up with someone for a couple of hours, depending on how long it takes, what you're doing. I once stayed with a party for 9 hours for a mount grind. I don't recommend it. But you're in a party up with someone for a few hours until y'all get what you needed from the content you're running, until everyone's good or has to go eat dinner. And then next time you come back to Party Finder, you're going to party with completely different people. And what this facilitates is that you're constantly interacting with new people. You're constantly interacting with people from different backgrounds, right? It's the bridging network kind of aspect that contributes to diversity. And this system within the game facilitates players taking advantage of the bridging network, because you can be in that big group bridging network all you want. If all you communicate with are the three people who play the game that you also know in real life, you can also be insulated, right? But there are systems within this game that kind of actively push you to take advantage of the bridging network. On the left, it's just an example of various link shells that are recruiting. Link shells are kind of like chat groups, and you can be in multiple at a time. You can only be in one free company at a time. It's like the guild and like guild in Final Fantasy XIV, but you can be in multiple link shells. So you can make a link shell with the friends you know in real life, but you can also make one with the people you roleplay with. You can make one with the people you raid with. You can make one for different whatever gameplay you want to engage in, different friend groups. And it just more encourages, again, this moving through the player base and engaging with as many people as possible. So fluid groups, right? Lessons learned from this. Players form temporary working groups for specific tasks, objectives, collaborations, right? And that's good. We want to encourage that, because that way, if we have the big player base of a bridging network type game, that way we encourage players to take advantage of that and to kind of engage with the diverse audience and practice those pro-social behaviors that they're using in the game with as many different people as possible. That's kind of the key here. They're not just practicing, pro-sociality with the same 5 people they know. They're practicing it over again and again with a bunch of different people from different backgrounds. providing players with opportunities to move through groups helps avoid those subgroups that can kind of normalize toxic behaviors amongst each other and validate each other in those behaviors. And yeah, it just allows you to be exposed to as many different viewpoints as possible, which again is kind of the advantage of this kind of big player base bridging network style. And then player turnover is kind of a subset of this group fluidity discussion. You're going to lose players in a game. You know, people are going to unsubscribe. They're going to move on to other games. It's inevitable. You're going to lose players at some point, right? And obviously, you don't want to lose all your players because then the game dies out. You want to keep recruiting new players, even just to, you know, make sure the game stays alive. But also, as more established players leave, what happens is they vacate positions of power, right? So, you know, if a guild leader decides, I don't know, it's time to move on, maybe someone else in the guild needs to take over. Or, you know, if, you know, someone who's really famous in the role-playing scene decides, oh, I'm giving up my house that was hosting, you know, this role-playing venue, that frees up and it opens up spots for newer players to move in and move beyond new player status by kind of filling these positions, right? And so you don't just want new players in the game, you want new players in the game that can kind of fill the vacuum that gets left by players that leave. And while we don't want everyone to leave our player base, of course, it's good that people sometimes leave, sometimes take breaks and return, because that adds to that group fluidity. If everyone who's ever started the game stays in the game, in Final Fantasy XIV, there's famously a housing crisis. Players can't, there's very limited housing. Say all that housing is taken and the players who have those houses never leave the game, they just stay there and keep their houses. No one entering the game later on is ever going to have a chance to get a house in the game, use it for any kind of social interaction, right? But because players who maybe started the game 10 years ago, 5 years ago, take breaks, leave, that kind of frees up areas of the game for newer players to come in, for fresh blood to come in and add to that diversity of the group. There's also research that suggests that newer players or players from marginalized identities are most likely, in terms of, you know, out of all players, to react with withdrawal when confronted with things like hate speech, harassment in games. So what happens when there's this kind of toxicity in a game is new players and players of marginalized identity are the first ones to leave. There's this component to it where games with a lot of toxicity kind of because of that lose their diversity, right? And so constantly recruiting players and maintaining diverse recruited players is very important, and goes a long way in kind of counteracting the snowball effect that would happen if there's harassment against marginalized players. Those marginalized players leave. There are even less diverse voices in the game community now, right? We want to avoid that. So we need to make sure that we're recruiting players and then, you know, integrating them. Which brings me to a Mez example where this failed miserably. Two domains, these are the two domains that I played with the most, New Jersey and New York. And a lot of this goes back to what happened with these domains during the COVID-19 pandemic. New York lost almost all of its members. Just people stopped playing. They were down to, I think, 3 players. And they lost a lot of institutional knowledge, which was rough on them. But what it led to was that a lot of kind of the old blood left and they kind of could rebuild from the beginning. And they developed a very strong recruitment culture because of that. And not just recruiting new players and having them kind of hang out on the sidelines, but recruiting them and integrating them into the volunteer positions that the Mez relies on. It's fully volunteer run. It relies on players to fill those positions. The New Jersey group, on the other hand, didn't really lose many players. They kind of maintained what a lot of players within the Mez refer to as the old boys club, a core group of players who's been playing the game for 20 years. They've kind of, you know, had a monopoly on the volunteer positions in the club. They also have a monopoly on in-character, in-game positions of power. And they made it very difficult for new players to become integrated into the game. So a lot of the new players from New York would visit New Jersey, but in New York, they were kind of taught and integrated and could kind of, you know, rise through the ranks of the organization, find ways of, you know, making themselves useful and feeling like they were part of the group. Whereas in New Jersey, they were often treated as visitors who didn't get to play important roles in the games, were just kind of tangentially there on the sidelines. Sure, you can play with us, but you're not part of the club, right? Um, and so what that led to was in New Jersey, new players got alienated, right? New players from marginalized identities who didn't feel like they could ever have a chance of becoming part of the established group. They showed up for a few games and then they would leave. There's a lack of communication, collaboration. New Jersey also is one of the few examples where there actually was a lot of infighting within the local group that alienated people. And New York, on the other hand, started recruiting out of necessity, and then that became part of its culture as the people who were recruited were used to that process and kept it going, right? And so they developed a culture of volunteering. Players are very willing to fill these positions. Players show very active interest in contributing to the growth of the community. And so that's kind of how those two groups diverged. One really was focused on keeping the group fluid, whereas the other one was very kind of set in its way and willing to just let that be the status quo. So the MES also has some systems in place for attempting to reward civic mindedness, mentoring, which is kind of my last point here. These pro-social behaviors, and that takes the form of point systems that you accumulate throughout of game actions. This includes everything from donating, voting in club elections, to giving someone a ride to the game, putting someone up if they need a place to sleep after a game ends late at night, helping other players, taking up a volunteer position rewards you with points. So all kinds of kind of civic action that makes the club run and helps your other players will give you points that you can use for in-game rewards. And this is successful in some ways and very unsuccessful in others. The problem was that people got really used to their civic engagement being driven by extrinsic motivators. They were trained to not help people because they wanted to help people, but because they get points to make their characters stronger. And one of the main issues that led to was that established players, just who've been playing this for 10 years or however long, have a huge head start over newer players that is really hard to bridge, right? It takes a really long time to accumulate enough points to be able to make your characters as powerful as some people who've been doing this for 10 years can do, because they've been accumulating points for 10 years. Very difficult for newer players to catch up, and that was often used against newer players. In-game, out-of-game, what happens then is more established players can just inherently have more powerful characters because they have these extra points to spend, and then those characters could much more easily bully the characters of newer players in-game. And often that bullying then transferred to out-of-character dynamics, which led to a lot of issues also between the local groups. There's little to no incentive to onboard new players to these systems and explain them. They're kind of complicated. I didn't understand how they worked for the first 6 months I was there. Because there's no incentive to create more competition. If newer players understand these systems and start collecting points, well, they can make their characters more powerful. This is, by the way, not a game where there are winners and losers. This is a role-playing game. But the system really brought out kind of the competitive nature in people. So there's no incentive to help anyone learn it and gain points. And it also de-incentivizes leaving leadership and volunteer positions because those give you points. So you'll be in situations where the same person's been, in charge for 5, 6, 7 years. And that kind of goes back to our issue of the groups are really static. It's easier for toxic behaviors to kind of become normalized. Because there's not a lot of fresh blood coming in. We're not taking advantage of the diversity that the group could potentially offer, right? So going back to a system that isn't perfect, but maybe is a little bit more successful. The mentoring system in Final Fantasy XIV is not a perfect system by any means. If anyone knows of a perfect mentoring system, I'd love to know. But it does do some things really well. The first one is that it has very clear symbols for showing someone who's a new player and who's a mentor. So we got the little sprout icon up here. If you're new, you get the sprout. If you're a mentor, you get the crown. There are little different sub-mentor groups, but the crown is kind of all you need to know. But this is opt-out. if you are a new player and you're saying, you know what, I don't want to be marked as a new player, you can turn off that sprout icon. You can even turn it back on again as long as you haven't met the cutoff where you're not considered a new player anymore, which involves playing at least 300 hours of the game and clearing all the main story up until the second most recent expansion. It's a lot of content. You're going to be a sprout for a long time. But if you don't want that symbol over your head, or you've made an alt character, you already know the game, you don't feel like you need to be seen as a new player, you can opt out, right? So that gives people kind of the freedom to either lean into wanting to be mentored and send that signal, hey, I am a sprout, I am new, I would like someone to mentor me, or to be like, hey, I new character, but I don't need that, right? It provides entry points for new players, both by signaling that you're new, and that symbol is also used. For example, here, an entry from the duty finder has the little sprout icon on it. You can specifically signal, hey, this is like open welcome to new players, even if you have no idea what you're doing, come join us, like we'll teach you, right? We'll figure it out together. It's ideally how that symbol is used, right? And it also kind of incorporates, or it ties into the design of the game that allows players to catch up. So unlike with the points of like the mess system, that where you're never going to catch up to someone who's been collecting these points for 10 years, in Final Fantasy 14, the main thing that's standing between you and, like, you know, starting with a new character and doing endgame content is just, are you clearing like the main storyline? You can rush through that if you want to. You can take your time. That's up to you. But at some point, you can kind of catch up to being back where, you know, players who've been doing this for like 5 years are in terms of progression, right? So because newer players can catch up, mentoring is really effective here because mentors can, in fact, help newer players get to this current content and can help them along their way to catching up. And what the game also does is it kind of links intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. You can kind of see this here where it talks about the rules for being a mentor. The second one, being an exemplar for player etiquette. That connects kind of to the intrinsic motivation of you want to play in a community whose norms you support, right? You want to play in a community that feels welcoming. And so you're setting that example for other players, right? The expectation is as a mentor, you are motivated not by getting like extra experience points, but you're motivated by being a member of a community and wanting to contribute to that community. And so it sets that example of kind of civic behavior, right? There are some rewards you can get for mentorship. Like, this is very difficult to get, takes a lot of time, but there's a mount you can get. That mount is made for 2 players. It's a 2-seater mount, which ties into the whole idea of like giving you more tools to then like mentor more people, right? So just some examples from the game that kind of use this. So in summary, mitigating toxic behavior is something that a lot of games are already trying to do, but rather than just saying how can we cut down on toxic behavior, part of what we should be looking at with games is how does the design of games and the systems they use actually encourage prosociality, prosocial behavior, civic engagement, right? And as a way to have that additionally counteract toxicity in games. Small group size with close bonds doesn't automatically guarantee prosociality. It can help, but it doesn't, that alone doesn't guarantee it, right? Especially in terms of does that behavior transfer outside the group. And more important than just group size is how fluid groups can be, especially when you're trying to apply this to a large overall player base, right? You're not going to be able to have just small groups in that case. So how can we keep groups fluid, keep them from stagnating, keep diverse opinions in as part of the group? And then finally, mentorship systems shouldn't overly much rely on extrinsic motivation because it kind of actually counteracts the civic engagement we're trying to foster here, right? So instead, it should focus on retention of players and enabling players to someday, or enabling new players to someday themselves become mentors and rise up that way and become integrated. All right, that's it. Thank you.